we're trying to look at educating and democracy matters during this particular series, and I suppose in some ways it follows on from those of you who were on the programme last term, the end of religious democracy with a huge question mark behind it. But we're going to look at democracy matters inspired by Athens and Jerusalem as the theme this evening. We look at the practice of democracy, we look at educating for politics, politics of justice, citizenship, citizens of the earth, active citizens, collective responsibility, and then educating for values. So that's the kind of territory we want to try and explore. If there's anyone who's not been on this program before, the pattern tends to be an input. Then Loretto allocates us to some rooms for group discussion. There are a couple of questions which nobody ever sticks to or answers, it seems to me, but that's okay. That's a democratic decision. And then we have a second input and finish the evening off with some open plenary discussion. Now, we are living, it seems, in the age of the strong men, and they are men. Authoritarian leaders are becoming central to global politics. And since 2000, these strong men have come to power in places like Moscow, Beijing, Delhi, Brasilia, Budapest, Ankara, Riyadh, Washington, and we might add London. These leaders, some of them have now been replaced. They're usually strong nationalists and social conservatives. Alike, they have little time, it seems, for minorities, for any form of dissent, and not much interest in foreigners. Homophobia abounds. They present themselves as champions of the ordinary people and standing against global elites. They each embody their nation, or they pretend that they do, reach for absolute power, and promote the cult of personality. We're now in a situation where someone has said that liberal values such as freedom of speech, independent courts, and minority rights are under assault all over the world. It is to be noted also that these assaults on strongman trends are shaped very often by religious nationalism. Putin and Russian Orthodoxy seem to be one, with Putin even quoting the Bible. Viktor Orban wants to keep Hungary Christian and keep Muslims out. Erdogan may be dismantling Turkey's secular constitution in favour of a Muslim state. In India, Modi has brought to the fore Hindu nationalism. And in an Easter message in 2022, when he was Prime Minister, Boris Johnston took to extensively quoting the Bible and invoking the resurrection of Christ. So not only is nationalism resurgent in the world, religious nationalism is also resurgent. And democracy is being hollowed out and diminished, and the gods are at the heart of it. So what if democracy matters? Perhaps democracy has always been under threat. In 1814, John Adams, an American president, wrote to a John Taylor and said, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." Earlier in 1796, George Washington warned that a republic's death is often an assisted suicide, he said. Is that what is going on in our world at present with the emergence of strong men threatening democracy globally? The strong men create wealthy elites around them. They're called oligarchs in Russia, but they all do it, often bringing their family members into the very powerful circle. The rich become rich and the poor become poorer. Mike Duncan has written much on the Roman Republic and its collapse. The dynamics are recognizable. There were or are the corrupt politics, rising economic inequalities, political polarization, the breakdown of unspoken rules of political conduct, endemic social and ethnic prejudice, battles over access to citizenship and voting rights, ongoing military quagmire, the introduction of violence as a political tool, and a set of elites so obsessed with their own privileges that they refused to reform the system in time to save it. That seemingly was the Roman Republic between the 80s and the 30s BCE. And Duncan writes again, as the decline of a Roman Republic shows, sharp inequality left unaddressed can be catastrophic, unleashing political and social consequences that can bring even a centuries-old republic to its end. So unaddressed inequalities lie at the heart of democratic suicide. Let's look at being inspired by Athens. Democracy in Greece, ancient Greece, was created and shaped by a response to the poor and social inequalities. Now, we need to remember that when we look for the origins of democracy. In 5th century Athens, the new thing in the governance and organization of political and social power was the inclusion of the poorest of the citizens in deciding policy and settling disputes. It wasn't totally inclusive, but it was a fairly radical sovereignty in that power lay with the people being the free male native inhabitants, including the poor, those of low status, and some of the worst educated. For free males, there was equality in the exercise of power and political freedom. Now, Athenian democracy didn't happen overnight. It evolved, it emerged gradually. And there were 4 key stages in the emergence of Athenian democracy. It began in 594 BCE when Solon, S-O-L-O-N, led the foundations of democracy. He did this by bringing about the abolition of debt slavery and bringing the poor citizens into the Citizens' Assembly. In 508, democracy was enhanced when Cleisthenes took on the oligarchs and divided Athens into 10 local administrative and cultic centres. This was a more extensive and wider form of democracy. In 462 BCE, Ephialtes introduced further democratic reforms. He put down the Areopagos, a powerful elite court that had claimed all government to itself. And Ephialtes undermined elite hegemony and stripped the Areopagos of its powers and was assassinated for his efforts at democratic reform. But he did introduce a different and a more authentic form of democracy. The 4th stage came with Pericles, a long-serving general and Athenian leader. And Pericles created a new definition of Athenian citizenship. Before, citizenship was only a citizen father, male. Now Pericles introduced the citizen mother. But what that did was to curb an elite practice of friendship marriages that kept power in the hands of the elite. But elite power was now watered down somewhat, reduced, and power was shared more widely, including the citizen mother. From 594 to 429 BCE, Solon put down the foundations of democratic equality. Cleisthenes and Pericles established democratic identity, and Ephialtes introduced democratic accountability. So democracy was born gradually and in stages. And the origins of Athenian democracy had to do with a new way of organizing power and in response to poverty and inequality. Tyranny was resisted and oligarchy was put down, and the wealthy elite were divested of dominance and control of society. Now, at the heart of this in practice was the ecclesia. That's not the church. But ecclesia is the Greek word for the assembly of all male citizens who choose to attend and vote. And any male citizen could attend and speak and vote. And the agenda of the assembly was managed by a council of 500. The 10 Athenian tribes supplied 50 men each chosen by lot from volunteers. They served in the council for 1 year. The assembly met up to 40 times a year. So democracy meant that the poor saw themselves as part of the city as a whole, and they opposed the wealthy elite who thought themselves special, but were now part of a much more democratic equality. So the roots of democracy lie in part in Athens. Later, Socrates and Plato, the former especially, introduced critical questioning, always critical questioning, as essential to politics and power and governance. They even profoundly questioned, whether democracy was the best path to the good human life. Question, question, question. That was Socrates and his pupil Plato. Always question politics and power. Always critically question democracy. Socrates questioned democracy and its practice because there was for him something more to the good human life. And that something more, he believed, was the achievement of moral and intellectual virtue. Unless moral and intellectual virtue underpin democracy and the good human life, there will be no real democracy and no good human life. Ethics and values are key. Athenian democracy didn't last. Between 322 and 321 BCE, it died when Alexander the Great came to power and the Macedonians imposed a property qualification for citizenship. Now the poor were excluded from democracy, and democracy for the moment was extinguished. Power, poverty, inequality led to the creation of democracy. And democracy was extinguished, committed suicide, if you like, when inequality and poverty were imposed by elites. Economics and democracy are still inseparable. And there is, above all, Socrates' moral and intellectual virtue. At this point, Loretto, perhaps we can go into rooms or groups. There are two questions which you may want to look at in the discussion. There was never a democracy yet, it was said, that did not commit suicide. Where do we see this happening today, and how is it happening? And what were, do you think, the strengths and the weaknesses in Athenian democracy? What shaped it? Maybe other questions, but have a good discussion for about 20 minutes. Go on in the second part. That's been an amazing discussion in many ways. We're inspired by Athens. Well, let's look at the inspiration that comes from Jerusalem then. And from the beginning of the 6th century to the end of the 5th century BCE, that's almost 200 years, Athenian democracy evolved. And the same Athens produced Socrates, a philosopher who questioned everything, including democracy. Here was a commitment to questioning, or as Cornel West has put it in our more modern context, a questioning of ourselves, of authority, of dogma, of parochialism, and of fundamentalism. And West goes on to stress that we must draw on the Socratic. He says, the Socratic commitment to questioning requires a relentless self-examination and critique of institutions of authority, motivated by an endless quest for intellectual integrity and moral consistency. So there is perhaps no democracy without critical questioning. That is the gift of Socrates. And in 399 BCE, democracy put him to death. The inspiration for democracy came not only from Athens, it also came from Jerusalem. We are inspired by Jerusalem and the tradition that emerged from there, without which we perhaps would not have democracy. The ancient Jewish tradition gave us two key insights and practices that have shaped democracy. There is a third, which has come to light in more recent times. The first is the ancient Jewish vision of individuals, all individuals, made in the image of God, and therefore of dignity and worth and value. Now, just how significant that is becomes clearer when the Jewish claim is set in historical and experiential context. It comes from the same era in which Athenian democracy was emerging. The Hebrew people had experienced the total destruction and collapse of Jerusalem, the entire social and political infrastructure, all their symbols of meaning, and a trauma that meant for them the death of God. The poor were left in the ruins of their raised city, while the better off and more educated and significant members of the society were taken into exile in Babylon. Now, not only was Marduk, the Babylonian god, the absolute sovereign and superior to their defeated god, the Babylonian people among whom they had to live were the conquerors and superior in every way. And yet somehow in Babylon, the Hebrew exiles reimagined the sacred, reimagined their identity and every other person's identity, and reimagined their purpose and their place in the world. They had poets by the rivers of Babylon. And out of that Babylonian exile and trauma, there emerged a profound mythopoetic poem or song. It was so profound that when in exile, they did a creative piece of editorial work, gathered together and shaped and reshaped material into what we know today as the Hebrew Bible. They placed their poem right at the beginning of the collection of sacred writings. This profound piece of poetic mythology or mythopoetry we know as Genesis 1. It is neither science nor history, but a myth and poetic form asserting that every human being is made in the image of God. It came out of exile in Babylon, out of trauma and unimaginable pain. It is the politics of equality and the dignity of all people. Ancient Israel lived the trauma of exile in a foreign land where only the Babylonian king and other Near Eastern kings were in the image of God. Only the king was in the image of God and therefore above everybody else. Now that created a hierarchical, patriarchal social order and organization of society. Inequality was built into the system and the structures of society. And to that politics of ideology, the Hebrews in exile shaped a radically different narrative. It wasn't even a narrative, but a poem, a song to be sung. Not just the king, but all people, all humankind were equally in the image of God. And that Genesis 1 vision proposed a very different ordering of society. Politics was not ideological, patriarchal, or nationalistic, but rooted in the deeply principled equality and dignity of all people without exception. Every human person has a unique and personal destiny and a quality of dignity. Democracy, if you like, emerged out of the Hebrew vision of every individual made in the image of God and every individual of equal worth and dignity. As Thomas Cahill put it, referencing also the American Constitution, often seen as a modern model of democracy, Cahill said, "There is no way it could ever have been self-evident that all men are created equal without the intervention of the Jews." Before leaving the remarkable writings that emerged from Babylonian exile, it is worth noting another profound insight or vision that was always there in Genesis, but confronts us now as people who are made in the image of God and all that means. There is a word play, more obvious in the Hebrew than in the English translations. The text speaks of Adam, which is not a male name, as it has become in some cultures. Adam is the Hebrew word for the human. It refers to the human being. And in the same line, there is the Hebrew word Adamna. You can hear the wordplay. Adam, Adamna. And Adamna is Hebrew for earth, soil, dust, dirt. The human is of the earth, not above the earth or outside of it, but of it. The human is earthling. We come from the earth, we go back to the earth, something affirmed in every burial service or cremation. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Every individual made in the image of God is also an earthling, which is also a radical equality. It is also a profound insight for an age that has become conscious of climate change, environmental destruction, and the collapse of ecological systems, of which we humans are an integral part. That we are earthlings with equal dignity and worth also means that all of nature has intrinsic value and dignity and worth. There is an eco-democracy in which the entire community of life has values and rights and dignity and worth. The other major inspiration and vision from Jerusalem is found in the Hebrew prophetic tradition. If Socrates was committed to critical questioning, the Hebrew prophets were committed to justice for all peoples. The Hebrew prophetic passion for social, political, and economic justice had its roots in every person in the image of God. It was also rooted in the Exodus narrative of liberation of nobodies from the social, political, and economic oppression and exploitation of Pharaoh, who was solely, remember, in the image of God and at the top of an imperial pyramid. The prophets' commitment to justice was rooted in their burning conviction that the God of the Exodus had one great love and passion: justice for all peoples. And Cornel West describes this commitment of the prophets to justice as one of the great moral moments in human history. Here we meet people older than Socrates. Prophets like Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others, a tradition at the heart of Jerusalem or ancient Israel. They challenged systems of injustice, especially economic injustice. They opposed political and religious elites, and they stood in solidarity with the oppressed and the marginalized and the excluded. Justice, or their vision of God's justice, was all about equality, but it was not equal. God was on the side of the poor, not with the economic elites, the might is right people, the kings who thought they were gods. The Hebrew prophets had a passion, a fervor, a quest for justice at all levels of society. And their vision of the sacred was a sacred compassion wedded to the divine love of justice. So those prophets put compassion and justice together. And the gift of the prophets was active commitment to compassionate justice and just compassion. And by compassion, they meant tenacious solidarity with the poor, the oppressed, the exploited, the victims of society. And by justice, they meant restorative social justice, bringing people back into community with an equality of dignity and worth, opportunity, safe, secure, and a fair share in the good things of life and all that makes for human and eco-flourishing. There is no democracy without justice for all, underpinned by compassion or tenacious solidarity with all. And the all includes the community of life, the eco-community. Cornel West again articulates the power and the gift of the Hebrew prophets. Prophetic love of justice, he writes, unleashes ethical energy and political engagement that explodes all forms of our egocentric predicaments or tribalistic mindsets. Its telling signs are ethical witness, including maybe martyrdom for some, moral consistency, and political activism, all crucial elements of our democratic armor for the fight against corrupt elite power. So in looking at democracy, it is important to be aware of what the ancient Greeks gave us. It's also important to be aware of the contribution to the practice of democracy of the ancient Hebrews or early Jewish people. We are heirs to the traditions of Athens and Jerusalem. Our inspiration and vision of democracy are rooted in Athens and in Jerusalem. We are Greek and we are Jewish, inspired to work for the perennial renewal and development and sustainability of democracy. Well, we have a couple of other questions we might want to look at in open plenary discussion. What are the strengths of the Genesis mytho-poem in relation to democracy? And why are the Hebrew prophets significant for democracy? And have we forgotten the contribution to democracy of Jerusalem? Or again, there may be other points you want to make.